The old van creaked as Harold woke before dawn, his arthritic hands finding Ruth's in the darkness. For months, this rusted shell had been their home, since the hospital bills took everything else. Through the window, morning mist clung to the river like memories to an aging mind. That's when Ruth saw it, a crumbling house on the opposite bank, nearly swallowed by nature's slow embrace. Its weathered sign almost whispered, $200. With trembling fingers, Harold counted their last dollars. Sometimes life's greatest chances come disguised as desperation. What would make two people in their 70s trade their final dollars for a collapsing ruin? Could a lifetime of love truly rebuild walls that time had condemned? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the riverside as Harold sat on the van's bumper, massaging his aching knees. 47 years of marriage, and here they were, their worldly possessions crammed into a 1992 Dodge with more rust than paint. He glanced at Ruth, who hummed softly while arranging wildflowers in a tin can. Even now, she found beauty in small things. "Did you take your medicine today?" he asked, knowing the answer. Ruth's humming paused. "We agreed, Harold. Just your heart pills until the check comes." Harold nodded, swallowing the familiar cocktail of guilt and anger. 6 months ago, they had owned a modest 2-bedroom apartment, filled with memories and the furniture he'd crafted with his own hands. Then came Ruth's fall, the surgery, the complications. Insurance covered some, but not enough. "Never enough. Mr. Davis at the pharmacy asked about you," Harold said, reaching for conversation that wasn't tinged with loss. "That kind man. Did you tell him we're on an extended camping trip?" Ruth's eyes crinkled with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Their children had offered help, James from Seattle, Marianne from Chicago. But what could they say? That after decades of independence, of never missing a bill payment, they'd failed? That their retirement had vanished into hospital corridors? No, they told their children they were downsizing, enjoying retirement on the road. The half-truths piled up like the medical bills had. Harold took out his wallet, thin now like his options, and removed the faded photograph tucked behind expired credit cards. Their wedding day, 1975. Ruth in her mother's altered dress, his hair still dark from Vietnam, both of them laughing at a joke forgotten to time. "We've weathered worse," Ruth said, settling beside him on the bumper, shoulder pressed to his. "Have we?" Harold wasn't so sure. At 72, his hands still knew how to shape wood into beautiful things, but shops wouldn't hire an old man with arthritis. Not when younger, faster hands were available. Their routines had adapted with surprising quickness. The YMCA 3 times a week for showers, the library for books and internet, the food pantry on Thursdays, where Ruth volunteered to maintain her dignity even as she accepted a box for themselves. They parked in different spots each night. Store lots, quiet streets, now this peaceful riverbank where the police rarely patrolled. "Remember when we camped in Yellowstone?" Ruth asked. "That bear that stole our cooler?" Harold chuckled despite himself. "You were more concerned about the pie inside than the bear. It was a good pie." Ruth leaned against him, warm and familiar. The river gurgled nearby, constant and unconcerned with human troubles. Harold watched a leaf spiral in the current, wondering how they'd become like that leaf, cut loose, drifting. Other van dwellers nodded in recognition when they passed. The silent brotherhood of the displaced. The mechanic who'd lost his shop. The nurse with medical debt of her own. The veteran who couldn't afford rent on disability payments. All of them invisible to the bustling world of mortgage payments and retirement accounts. "I was thinking," Ruth said carefully, the tone she used when broaching difficult subjects. "The Social Security should come next week. We could look for a room to rent, maybe." Harold stared at the river. A room would mean stability, but would drain their meager checks completely. No buffer for emergencies, no funds for Ruth's postponed medications. "Let's see what comes," he said finally. "We're managing for now." Ruth didn't push. After nearly 5 decades, she knew when his stubbornness masked fear. As evening approached, Harold prepared their dinner on the small camp stove. Beans and hot dogs, with the last apple split between them. Ruth had arranged their sleeping space with care, transforming the van's interior into something almost home-like, with scarves draped over boxes and their few books arranged on a makeshift shelf. Later, as crickets chirped and the river whispered secrets to the shore, Harold lay awake. Ruth's breathing had deepened into sleep, her hand still holding his, as it had through countless nights. Tomorrow would bring the same challenges: where to park, where to find work, how to maintain appearances when calling their children. But tomorrow would also bring sunrise over the river. Ruth smiled as she discovered some small treasure on her morning walk. Perhaps a few hours of work helping someone stack firewood or fix a fence. Enough for gas money, maybe a treat to see Ruth's eyes brighten. It wasn't the retirement they'd planned. But as Harold finally drifted toward sleep, he realized with surprise that despite everything, they were still them. Still Harold and Ruth Mitchell, who'd faced life together since 1975. That, at least, the bills hadn't taken. Morning arrived with the sound of geese overhead and the gentle rocking of the van as Harold shifted to ease his stiffened back. He rose carefully, not wanting to wake Ruth. Outside, mist hovered above the river's surface. The world still hushed in dawn's embrace. Harold retrieved the old red toolbox from under the van's seat, setting it on a flat stone by the water. He opened it with reverence, as another man might open a family Bible. Inside lay the survivors of his former workshop: a handplane, chisels with handles worn to the shape of his grip, a dovetail saw, and various smaller tools he couldn't bear to sell. "Good morning," Ruth said from behind him, wrapping a cardigan around her shoulders against the morning chill. "Did I wake you?" Harold asked, running his thumb along a chisel's edge. Still sharp, like the memory of the shop he'd once owned. No, the birds did. Ruth settled beside him, peering into the toolbox. "You should try the Carpenters' Union again." Harold shook his head. "They need climbers, roofers, young men's jobs. Then try Mr. Whitaker at the furniture store." "Your restoration work was," Harold corrected. "Was good. No one wants an old man with shaky hands touching their antiques." Ruth fell silent, reaching into the toolbox to touch a small wooden bird, a chickadee Harold had carved decades ago when they'd first married. She'd kept it on her classroom desk until retirement. "I'm going to walk along the river," she announced, standing with a grace that belied her 69 years. "Want to join me?" Harold shook his head, closing the toolbox. "I'll get breakfast started." Their morning ritual unfolded with practiced efficiency. Harold heated water on the camp stove for instant coffee, while Ruth returned with wild mint for tea. They shared a packet of oatmeal, enhanced with the blackberries Ruth had found. "Frank's coming by later," Harold said between spoonfuls. Ruth's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "With work?" "Maybe," said he might need help clearing brush for a client. Frank, a landscape gardener 30 years their junior, occasionally threw odd jobs Harold's way. Day labor, cash under the table. Harold suspected it was partly charity, but he couldn't afford pride these days. "I saw Martha from the food pantry yesterday," Ruth said, changing the subject. "She asked if I'd help sort donations today." Harold nodded. Ruth's volunteer work kept her spirits up, though he worried about the toll it took on her energy. The doctors had warned about overexertion after her surgery, but warnings meant little when necessity beckoned. After breakfast, they followed the riverside trail toward town. Other unhoused individuals nodded in greeting. The young woman who slept in her station wagon with 2 cats. The bearded man who'd once been an accountant before alcoholism claimed his career. Harold and Ruth didn't quite belong to this community, nor to the one they'd left behind. They existed in between, in a liminal space of temporary impermanence that had somehow stretched to months. "We should call Marianne tonight," Ruth said as they walked. "Phone card's almost empty." "She worries when we don't call," Harold grunted. Their daughter's concern was genuine but suffocating. each call a careful dance around the truth. Elaborate stories about RV parks and tourist attractions they'd never seen. They parted at the library, Ruth to the food pantry 2 blocks over, Harold to use the computers for his daily job search ritual. The librarian, Ms. Collins, greeted him with a smile that held no pity, one of the small mercies of his new life. For an hour, Harold scrolled through listings he was either overqualified for or physically unable to perform. He sent 3 applications with little hope attached to them, then checked their meager bank balance. The Social Security deposit was due in 4 days. Not soon enough to refill Ruth's prescriptions, but it would keep gas in the van and food in their stomachs. Frank arrived as promised that afternoon, his pickup pulling alongside their van where it was parked near the public boat launch. "Got a clearing job," he announced without preamble. "Homeowner wants brush removed from the back lot. Pays $60 for the day." Harold nodded, retrieving work gloves from the van. "I appreciate it, Frank." The younger man shrugged. "Could use the help. You still got the strongest hands of anyone I know." It wasn't true anymore, but Harold accepted the kindness for what it was. As they drove to the job site, Harold stared out at the passing neighborhoods, homes with solid foundations, power lines, running water. All the things he'd once taken for granted. Ruth doing okay? Frank asked. "She's managing. And you?" Harold looked down at his hands. Workers' hands, builders' hands, now curled with arthritis but still capable. Still his. "I'm managing too," he said, and was surprised to find it wasn't entirely a lie. "You're making it too complicated," Ruth said, watching Harold fuss with the small wooden structure. "It needs to drain properly or the seeds will rot." Harold adjusted the roof angle of the bird feeder he was constructing from discarded fence. Pickets. They sat at a weathered picnic table near their usual parking spot, the late afternoon sun warming their shoulders. 3 months by the river had taught them its rhythms when the park rangers made their rounds, which spots flooded during heavy rain, where the morning sun hit first. "The birds won't file complaints," Ruth teased, sorting through her collection of river findings. Smooth stones, interestingly shaped driftwood, a blue jay feather. Harold made a non-committal sound focused on his work. The simple act of creation, of making something useful with his hands, eased the constant ache of displacement. The bird feeder wouldn't feed them, wouldn't solve their housing crisis, but it would bring birds, and that would bring Ruth joy. "Eddie's coming by later," Ruth mentioned, referring to the park ranger who'd become something of an ally. "Says he has extra sandwiches from some event." Harold nodded, not looking up. Eddie was kind, but represented a reality Harold still struggled to accept, that they were now people who needed kindness, who accepted leftover sandwiches with gratitude. A splash from the river drew their attention. A great blue heron stood motionless in the shallows, a statue until the lightning strike of its beak into water. "Successful hunter," Ruth observed, as the bird lifted a small fish. "More successful than me," Harold muttered. Ruth's hand covered his, warm and familiar. "You've hunted up $60 from Frank, 20 from helping Mrs. Abernathy with her fence, and that lovely loaf of bread from the baker when you fixed his shelf." "Crumbs," Harold said, but his tone softened. Their van, home, transportation, and last vestige of independence needed repairs Harold couldn't afford. The transmission made worrying sounds on hills, and the right rear tire showed sidewall damage. Problems that would compound until immobility forced harder choices. "I spoke with Celia today," Ruth said carefully. "Celia ran the women's shelter downtown. They have a program for senior housing assistance." Harold's jaw tightened. "We're not splitting up. No," she mentioned, "married couples can—" "I'm not living on handouts in some government box." Ruth withdrew her hand, her silence speaking volumes. Harold immediately regretted his tone. It wasn't Ruth's fault that a lifetime of work had led to this precarious existence. It wasn't her fault that his pride remained intact while everything else crumbled. "I'm sorry," he said, setting down his tools. "I just need more time to figure things out." Ruth nodded, but her eyes held concerns she'd stopped voicing aloud. Winter would arrive eventually. The van's heater worked sporadically. Their situation, barely manageable in mild weather, would become dangerous with frost. "There," Harold said, holding up the finished feeder. "Where should we hang it?" Ruth's smile returned as she pointed to a riverside maple. "There, where we can see it from the van." While Harold secured the feeder to a branch, Ruth chatted with Maria, who lived in her station wagon with her cats. Their small community of vehicle dwellers had unspoken rules: watch each other's belongings, share information about public restroom access, alert others about police activity. "Library's hosting a job fair Thursday," Maria told Ruth. "Seasonal retail." "Mostly, but it's something." Ruth thanked her, though she knew Harold would resist. At 72, standing for 8-hour shifts at a cash register seemed impossible, yet they're dwindling. Options might make the impossible necessary. Evening approached with the rich amber light that transformed even their modest circumstances into something with dignity. Harold and Ruth sat in canvas chairs beside the van, watching the river flow as they ate the sandwiches Eddie had delivered. "Remember fishing with James when he was little?" Ruth asked, her thoughts drifting with the current. "How excited he was with that tiny sunfish." Harold chuckled. "Called it a monster fish for weeks." These shared memories sustained them, proof that they'd lived full lives before this chapter, that they'd raised children, celebrated anniversaries, planted gardens at homes now belonging to others. "We should call him Tomorrow," Harold said. "His birthday's coming up." Ruth nodded, not mentioning the phone card they couldn't afford to replace. Tomorrow would require its own solutions. As darkness settled over the river, they witnessed the day's final offering, a sunset that painted the water copper and gold, transforming their humble campsite into something almost regal. The first visitors arrived at the bird feeder, chickadees investigating this new addition to their territory. Ruth reached for Harold's hand. For this moment, watching birds discover the gift they'd offered, they weren't homeless seniors with uncertain futures. They were simply two people, still capable of creating small moments of beauty in an unforgiving world. "Home is where we are," Ruth whispered, echoing words they'd spoken to each other through decades of changes. Harold squeezed her hand in response, his throat too tight for words, knowing that tomorrow's worries would return with the dawn. The morning dawned with unusual clarity, autumn's crisp edges beginning to sharpen the air. Ruth woke before Harold, slipping out of their van without disturbing his rare, deep sleep. These quiet moments alone had become precious, space to breathe without managing her expressions for Harold's benefit, without the careful optimism she maintained to balance his pessimism. She collected the small metal cup from their camping supplies and made her way to the river's edge. Mist hovered above the water, transforming the familiar landscape into something mysterious. Ruth dipped the cup into the clear water to wash her face. The shock of cold, a welcome reset to her senses. From the pocket of her cardigan, she retrieved the old binoculars, a gift from Harold on their 30th anniversary, when birdwatching had become her weekend passion. Now they served as her window to a wider world, confined by limited mobility and resources. Ruth focused first on a kingfisher perched on a branch downstream, its proud profile distinct against the morning sky. She tracked its sudden dive into the water and triumphant emergence with breakfast secured. Nature carried on its ancient rhythms, unconcerned with human catastrophes like medical bills and homelessness. She panned across the river, observing the opposite bank she rarely visited. Their usual spot offered easier access to town, but the far shore held wild beauty with its untamed vegetation and steep banks. That's when she noticed something unexpected through a break in the trees, the angular lines of a structure almost completely overtaken by nature. Ruth adjusted the binoculars, focusing more carefully. A house, or what remained of one. From this distance, she could make out a slumping roof, weathered wooden siding and windows like hollow eyes. Most notably, something reflected morning light near what must be the front path, a sign of some sort. "What are you looking at so intently?" Harold's voice came from behind her. Ruth lowered the binoculars, suddenly aware of her racing heart. "There's a house across the river. I never noticed it before. Harold squinted across the water.
Where?
Here, she said, handing him the binoculars and directing his gaze. Through that gap in the trees. Harold was silent as he studied the distant structure, his expression unreadable. Finally, he handed the binoculars back. Abandoned. Probably condemned. There's a sign, Ruth persisted. I can't make out what it says. Harold turned toward their camp stove. Probably no trespassing. Coffee? But Ruth couldn't let go of her discovery. While Harold prepared their meager breakfast, she kept returning to the binoculars, studying the dilapidated structure. Something about it called to her, perhaps simply because it was more overlooked than they were, more forgotten by the world. We should go look, she said over their shared instant coffee. At what? A falling down shack? It might be interesting. An adventure. Ruth knew the word would catch Harold's attention. Adventure had been their shared language once. Before caution and necessity narrowed their world, Harold sighed. But she recognized the sound, not rejection, but consideration. The river's low right now. We could cross at the shallow point, Ruth smiled, victorious. After breakfast, they secured their few valuables in the van and walked downstream to where the river widened and slowed, creating a natural ford. Harold tested the depth with a branch. Knee-deep at most, he announced. Sure you want to do this? Ruth was already removing her shoes and rolling up her pant legs. The cold water sent shockwaves up her legs as she stepped in, but she pressed forward, Harold close behind, with a steadying hand at her elbow. The opposite shore felt different somehow, wilder, untouched. They followed a faint game trail through tangled undergrowth, Harold breaking spiderwebs with a stick as they walked. The house revealed itself gradually. First the chimney, then the sagging roofline. Finally, the full structure, as they emerged into what had once been a yard. My God, Harold whispered. Up close, the house was both more tragic and more compelling. A small wooden structure that might once have been charming, a fisherman's cottage perhaps, or a modest family home. Decades of neglect had allowed nature to begin reclaiming it, with vines climbing walls and saplings growing through what remained of a porch. And there, near the overgrown path, stood a weathered sign on a leaning post. They approached slowly, as if the house were a sleeping creature they might disturb. Ruth brushed away dead leaves that obscured the text. For sale, $200. Call number below if interested. The phone number beneath was faded but legible. Harold and Ruth exchanged a look that contained decades of unspoken understanding. $200, Ruth said. Her voice barely audible. Harold stared at the structure, his woodworker's eye already assessing, calculating. It's falling apart. It has walls, a roof. It's standing. Barely. Ruth touched the sign gently, as if it might dissolve under her fingers. It's the same amount we have left. Harold didn't respond, but he stepped closer to the house, peering through a broken window. Ruth watched his expression shift from skepticism to something she hadn't seen in months. Possibility. Let me look inside before we get carried away, he said. But his tone had changed. Ruth smiled, knowing they would call the number. Some choices were made before words ever confirmed them. You, Harold, and Ruth Mitchell. The man who introduced himself as Elias Finch was younger than they expected, mid-40s perhaps, with the weathered look of someone who worked outdoors. His pickup truck had seen better decades, not unlike themselves. Yes, Harold answered, extending his hand. They'd arranged to meet at the public boat launch. Neutral territory that wouldn't reveal their living situation. Didn't expect folks to be interested in that old place, Finch said, accepting Harold's handshake. Been trying to unload it for 2 years. It belonged to you? Ruth asked. My uncle. Left it to me when he passed. Haven't had the heart or money to fix it up, and the county's been sending notices about code violations. He shifted uncomfortably. Look, I should be straight with you. That place needs everything. Plumbing's shut. Electrical's dangerous if it works at all. Probably should be torn down. Harold nodded slowly. We'd like to see inside first, if that's all right. 20 minutes later, they stood in what had once been a living room. Finch had unlocked the front door after considerable effort, with a key that protested years of disuse. Inside, the musty scent of abandonment greeted them along with evidence of animal inhabitants. Uncle Joe was a fisherman, Finch explained, gesturing to mounted rods on the wall, somehow untouched by the scavengers who'd taken more valuable items. Lived here 40 years. Built most of it himself. Harold's attention was elsewhere, on the bones of the structure. His experienced eye noted the solid oak beams, the hand-cut joinery. Beneath the decay and neglect lay craftsmanship rarely seen in modern construction. Foundations still good, he murmured, more to himself than the others. Ruth wandered toward the back of the house, where broken windows allowed light to stream into what had been a kitchen. Through the glassless frame, she could see a weed-choked yard that sloped gently to the river. There was a garden here once, she said, recognizing the ghosts of orderly rows beneath the wilderness. Finch shrugged. Uncle kept vegetables. Fruit trees out back too, probably gone wild by now. Harold had moved to examining the roof, where daylight penetrated through several sizable holes. Going to need complete re-roofing. Like I said, it needs everything, Finch repeated. That's why the price is so low. County assessed the land at $8,000, but the structure's considered a liability. Ruth and Harold exchanged glances, a silent conversation born of decades together. Hope mingled with fear, possibility with pragmatism. Could we have a moment alone? Harold asked. Finch nodded. I'll wait outside. Take your time. When the door closed behind him, Ruth turned to Harold. Well, it's a wreck, he said plainly. Worse than I thought, but fixable. Harold ran a hand along a solid wooden door frame. With enough time, money, and materials, maybe. The bones are good. Old Joe knew what he was doing. Ruth moved to the center of the room and closed her eyes, listening to the house. Beyond the dripping water and creaking wood, she sensed something else. Possibility. Our money's almost gone anyway, she said quietly. The van won't last another winter. This place won't keep out the winter either. Not in its current state, Harold countered. But his tone lacked conviction. But it would be ours, Ruth said simply. No more moving every night. No more pretending to our children. Harold was silent, calculating impossible sums in his head. How to make a habitable space with no funds. How to rebuild with nothing but his aging hands and determination. We could start with one room, Ruth continued, sensing his thoughts. Make it weathertight. There's a wood stove in the corner that might work. And when the money runs out completely, Harold asked, the question that haunted their every decision. It's running out anyway, Ruth said. At least here we'd have walls. A roof, eventually. A place to belong. Harold moved to the window, looking out at the overgrown property that stretched to the river's edge. Land that would be theirs. A foundation that wouldn't move. The opposite of their current floating existence. $200, he murmured. Our last $200. Ruth touched his arm. For a home, Harold. The word hung in the musty air between them. Home. Not shelter, not housing, but home. The thing they'd lost and tried to recreate in the confined space of their van. When they emerged onto the sagging porch, Finch was leaning against his truck, smoking. He straightened when he saw their expressions. We'll take it, Harold said. The transaction was completed with surprising simplicity. Cash handed over, a bill of sale written on the back of a hardware store receipt, a handshake. Finch seemed almost apologetic as he passed Harold the rusted key. Good luck, he said. Hope you can make something of it. As his truck disappeared down the rutted drive, Ruth and Harold stood side by side before their purchase, a crumbling structure that most would consider worthless. What have we done? Harold whispered. Ruth's fingers closed around his, warm and sure. We've come home. Their first night as homeowners was spent in the van, parked on their own property, a strange juxtaposition that wasn't lost on either of them. Morning arrived with the harsh reality of what they'd purchased, a structure that seemed even more dilapidated in daylight. We'll need to clear the inside first, Harold said. Standing in what had been the living room, now littered with fallen plaster, animal droppings, and decades of decayed leaves blown in through broken windows, Ruth nodded, already pulling on the gardening gloves she'd kept from their apartment life. I'll start gathering the trash. We'll need bags and tools and materials. Harold's voice carried the weight of overwhelming practicality. "And money we don't have." Ruth paused, straightening to look at her husband directly. "One task at a time, Harold. Today we clean." They worked methodically, Harold focusing on structural hazards while Ruth cleared debris. By midday, they'd filled 3 makeshift garbage bags with the detritus of abandonment. The work was physically demanding, their bodies protesting years of relative comfort followed by months of cramped van living. "Look what I found," Harold called from what had once been a back bedroom. Ruth made her way carefully across creaking floorboards to find him standing before an interior door that had fallen from its hinges but remained largely intact, solid oak with 5 panels, its craftsmanship visible despite years of neglect. "It's beautiful," Ruth said, running her fingers over the wood. "Old-growth timber," Harold noted, professional appreciation in his voice. "They don't make them like this anymore. Most of the other doors are either missing or damaged beyond repair. Can we use it?" Harold nodded slowly. "Clean it up, rehang it. It's a start." That simple door became their first reclamation project, a tangible symbol that not everything was beyond saving. While Ruth continued clearing, Harold carefully removed the tarnished brass hardware, setting the pieces in vinegar to dissolve decades of corrosion. By late afternoon, exhaustion forced them to pause. They sat on the sagging porch steps, sharing a thermos of water and surveying what they'd accomplished and how much remained. "The roof has to be first priority," Harold said, squinting up at the gaping holes. "Rain's in the forecast for tomorrow." Ruth's gaze followed his. "Could we patch it temporarily? With tarps, maybe?" "We'd need tarps and rope. And a ladder." Harold's litany of necessities they couldn't afford hung between them. "Perhaps," Ruth began, but was interrupted by the sound of tires on gravel. A pickup truck they didn't recognize pulled into their overgrown drive. An elderly man emerged, surveying their property with undisguised curiosity. "Heard someone bought old Joe's place," he called, approaching with the deliberate gait of someone with arthritic knees. "I'm Ray Cooper. Live half-mile downstream." Harold stood to shake the man's hand. "Harold Mitchell. My wife Ruth." Ray nodded at Ruth. "Brave folks taking this on. Joe's been gone 8 years now. Place has suffered. We're discovering that," Harold admitted. Ray's weathered face creased with a smile. "Brought you something? Housewarming, you might say." He gestured toward his truck. In the truck bed lay coils of rope, a blue tarp, and a hammer. "Figured you might need basics." "Storm's coming tomorrow." Harold stared at the offerings, pride warring with necessity. Ruth stepped forward. "That's incredibly kind. We were just discussing tarps for the roof." "Got a ladder, too," Ray said. "Can bring it by tomorrow morning. Help you get that tarp up before the rain hits." Harold found his voice. "We appreciate it, but—" "No obligations," Ray interrupted, seeming to understand Harold's hesitation. "Just being neighborly. Joe was good to me when my Margaret passed. Loaned me his fishing boat whenever the grief got too heavy. Figure I owe his house some kindness. The simple framing of the offer, a debt to the house, rather than charity to them, allowed Harold's pride. The space it needed to breathe. We'd be grateful for the ladder," he said finally, after Ray left. Promising to return the next day, Ruth and Harold stood in silence, processing this unexpected development. "There's still good in the world," Ruth said softly. Harold nodded. Gazing at the salvaged door he'd spent the afternoon carefully cleaning. "We should get back to work while there's light." They worked until dusk made it dangerous to continue, then returned to the van for a simple dinner. As night fell, they sat outside on folding chairs, looking at their house. Still broken, still overwhelming, but somehow different now. "One step at a time," Ruth said, echoing her earlier words. Harold reached for her hand in the darkness. "The door first, then the roof, then everything else," Ruth added with quiet determination. Above them, stars emerged in the clear night sky, witnesses to this precarious new beginning. The retired woodworker and the former teacher, starting over at an age when most had settled into the predictable rhythms of secure retirement. "Are we crazy?" Harold asked the night. Ruth's soft laugh carried no regret. "Probably. But we're not alone anymore." Harold squeezed her hand. thinking of Ray Cooper and his unexpected kindness, of the salvage door waiting inside, of the journey stretching before them, impossible yet somehow already begun. Rain drummed against the blue tarp stretched tightly over the roof, the sound both comforting and concerning. Comforting because they were underneath it, relatively dry despite the downpour. Concerning because the occasional drip reminded them how precarious their shelter remained. "It's holding," Ruth observed. Positioned strategically beneath one of the few sections of ceiling that didn't leak, Harold nodded, watching a worrying bulge where water collected in the center of the tarp. For now, the morning had been a flurry of activity. True to his word, Ray had arrived with a ladder and additional tarps. Together, the men had climbed onto the damaged roof, Harold moving more cautiously than he would have a decade ago, and secured the bright blue covering over the worst sections. Ruth had handed up tools and offered guidance from below, her teacher's voice carrying clearly despite the rising wind. Now, confined indoors by the storm, they took stock of their situation. The house consisted of 4 rooms, what had once been a living area, kitchen, and 2 small bedrooms, plus a rudimentary bathroom addition that had suffered the worst damage. The previous night in the van had made it clear they needed to create one habitable room quickly. "The smaller bedroom," Ruth suggested, marking dimensions with her steps. "It has the fewest broken windows, and the floor seems most solid." Harold ran his hand along the wall. "We could seal it off from the rest temporarily. Concentrate our efforts." A crash from the kitchen interrupted their planning. They hurried to find a section of ceiling had collapsed under the weight of water, bringing down ancient plaster and rotted wood. "That wasn't part of today's schedule," Ruth said, her attempt at humor belied by the tremor in her voice. Harold surveyed the damage with the calm assessment of someone who had built and repaired structures for decades. "Actually simplifies things. Was coming down eventually. Now we don't have to pull it down ourselves." They worked side by side, clearing the fallen debris, salvaging what little could be saved. The physical labor was taxing for both, their bodies reminding them frequently of their age. But with each armload of debris removed, the impossible task became incrementally more manageable. By mid-afternoon, the rain had slowed to a steady drizzle. A pickup truck appeared in their drive, different from Ray's. A woman emerged, perhaps 50, carrying a covered dish. "Hello," she called from a safe distance from the sagging porch. "I'm Martha Cooper, Ray's daughter-in-law." Ruth wiped her hands on her jeans and went to greet her. "Ruth Mitchell. This is very kind of you. Dad mentioned you were fixing up Joe's old place. Thought you might appreciate a hot meal. It's just chicken and rice, nothing fancy." The casserole dish radiated warmth into Ruth's hands, the first food they hadn't prepared themselves in months. "Would you like to come in? It's not much yet, but..." Martha glanced at the blue tarp and broken windows. "Rain check? I should get back. Grandkids visiting." Her smile softened the refusal. "We're at the white farmhouse with the red barn, about a mile down the main road. Stop by any time." After Martha left, Harold and Ruth sat on upturned buckets in the small bedroom they'd designated as their first project, sharing the unexpected feast. "They're curious about us," Harold said between bites. "Wouldn't you be? Elderly couple buys abandoned wreck, moves in with nothing." Ruth savored another spoonful. "But curiosity brought us warm food, so I won't complain." Harold nodded thoughtfully. "We need to get the van unloaded. Move our essentials in here, tonight." He glanced around the room, still dirty, windows covered with scraps of plastic, floor scattered with tools. "Tomorrow, maybe. After we clean up a bit more." Ruth set down her fork. "Harold, the van isn't sustainable. We both know that. We need to commit to being here, even while we're fixing it. In a room with no proper roof, no electricity, no running water. In our home," Ruth said firmly. "However imperfect." Harold was silent for a long moment. "Then I'll move the mattress in tonight. We can seal this room better than the others." They worked until fading light made it impossible to continue, sealing broken windows with plastic and tape, sweeping decades of dust from the wooden floor. Harold rehung the salvage door, its brass hardware gleaming after Ruth's careful polishing. The simple act of closing a door, of creating a boundary between themselves and the chaos beyond, felt like a victory. By nightfall, they had transferred their bedding and essential belongings from the van. The blue tarp overhead rippled gently with the evening breeze, but held firm against lingering showers. Ruth arranged their battery-powered lantern on a makeshift table, an overturned crate that had once held someone's possessions, now serving as their first piece of furniture. "Not exactly the retirement we planned," Harold said. Settling onto their mattress now positioned on the floor, Ruth reached for his hand in the lantern's soft glow. "I don't know. We have a roof thanks to that tarp. We have neighbors. We have possibilities, and a mountain of work ahead. One day at a time," Ruth reminded him, her eyes reflecting the light with unmistakable determination. "Tomorrow we tackle the floor." Harold nodded, his gaze traveling to the blue tarp overhead. Flimsy protection against the elements, but protection nonetheless. Like their situation, precarious, temporary, but with the promise of improvement. "One day at a time," he echoed, and pulled their blanket closer against the night's chill. The garden shed had seemed beyond salvaging, roof completely collapsed, walls leaning at impossible angles. Harold had marked it for demolition once they had the means and strength. But Ruth, ever curious, had insisted on exploring before condemning it entirely. "Be careful," Harold cautioned as Ruth picked her way through the wreckage. "That whole structure could come down any minute." "I just want to see if there's anything useful," she replied, stooping to peer under a fallen shelf. Their third week as homeowners had established a rhythm to their days. Mornings spent on essential repairs, sealing windows, reinforcing weak floors, patching the worst roof leaks beyond the tarped areas. Afternoons dedicated to clearing debris and salvaging what could be saved. Evenings planning the next day's work by lantern light, their muscles aching but spirits gradually lifting with each small improvement. "Oh!" Ruth's exclamation brought Harold to the shed entrance. "What is it?" "Are you hurt?" Ruth emerged with a rusted metal box clutched carefully in her hands. "Look what I found." Inside the box, protected from moisture and pests, lay dozens of small paper packets, each labeled in faded handwriting. Marigold, Black-Eyed Susan, coneflower, lavender, seeds collected and saved by the previous owner. "Do you think they're still viable?" Harold asked as Ruth spread the packets on their makeshift table. "Some might be. Seeds can remain dormant for years under the right conditions." Ruth's fingers traced the handwritten labels reverently. Old Joe was a gardener too. That discovery shifted something in their approach to the property. Until now, they had focused solely on the house, making it weather-tight, creating livable space. But the seeds reminded them that the land itself offered possibilities. The following morning, Ruth was outside before Harold woke, clearing a small patch of ground near the kitchen window. "What are you doing?" he asked, coffee mug in hand, watching her work with surprising energy, starting a test plot. Ruth sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her brow despite the cool morning. "If even a few of these seeds germinate, we'll have flowers by summer's end." Harold didn't point out the impracticality of flowers when they still lacked running water and proper sanitation. He recognized the light in Ruth's eyes, the same determination that had spotted the house across the river in the first place. "I'll help after I finish reinforcing that floor joist," he offered. By midday, they had prepared a small garden bed. Ruth carefully opened several seed packets, testing the contents between her fingers. "These feel dry, not moldy," she said of the marigold seeds. "I think they might grow." "Even if they don't, we can get new seeds next spring," Harold said, surprising himself with the long-term planning implied by his words. Ruth smiled, catching the significance. "Yes, we can, but I think these will grow." They'd been waiting for someone to plant them again. They were interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching. Not one, but 3 pickup trucks made their way up the rutted drive, parking in a loose semicircle. Ray Cooper emerged from the first, followed by his son Michael and daughter-in-law Martha from the second. The third contained a young couple Harold and Ruth hadn't met. "Hope we're not intruding," Ray called, approaching with a casserole dish, similar to the one Martha had brought earlier. "Not at all," Ruth responded, rising to greet them despite her mud-streaked hands. "Brought some folks who wanted to meet you," Ray continued. "This here's my son Michael, and you met Martha. And that's Tom and Sarah Jenkins from down the road." Handshakes and introductions followed, slightly awkward as Harold and Ruth became aware of their appearance. Clothes worn and dirty from days of hard work. Living conditions primitive at best. "We heard you're fixing up old Joe's place," Tom said, glancing at the blue-tarped roof and plastic-covered windows. "Quite an undertaking. We're taking it one day at a time," Harold replied, the phrase now a mantra between him and Ruth. "Brought some things that might help," Michael said, gesturing to the trucks. "Community cleanup day at the church, and some materials nobody needed." Harold and Ruth watched in astonishment as their neighbors began unloading supplies, stacks of dimensional lumber, boxes of nails, rolls of roofing felt, cans of paint, even a slightly dented wood stove. "We can't possibly accept all this," Harold protested weakly, overwhelmed by the generosity. "It was headed for the dump," Michael said with a shrug that didn't quite disguise the kindness behind the gesture. "I figured it could do some good here instead. Besides," Martha added, "Tom's a roofer. Said he might be able to help get a proper roof on before winter comes." Tom nodded. "Got some leftover shingles from my last job. Not enough for the whole house, but could cover the main sections." Ruth's hand found Harold's, squeezing tight as they absorbed what was happening. Strangers, no. Neighbors, offering not just materials but skills, time, effort. "We don't know what to say," Ruth finally managed. "Say you'll join us for the Harvest Festival next month," Sarah suggested with a warm smile. Community should know its newest members after they left, promising to return the following Saturday to help with the roof. Ruth and Harold stood surrounded by the unexpected bounty of materials. "I told you the seeds would grow," Ruth said softly. Harold looked confused. "They haven't even sprouted yet. Not those seeds." Ruth gestured to the tire tracks in their drive, the gifts of lumber and supplies. "The seeds of belonging. We planted those the day we decided to rebuild this place." Harold nodded slowly, understanding. Like the wildflower seeds waiting in their paper packets, something dormant was awakening, not just in the house or garden, but in themselves and their connection to this place and its people. 6 weeks after purchasing the house, Harold stood on the newly secured section of porch, surveying his creation with critical eyes. The chair looked nothing like the precisely crafted furniture he'd made in his workshop years ago. Its components, driftwood collected from the riverbank during his morning walks, retained their natural curves and weathered patina. Joints were secured with salvaged screws and nails. The seat woven from thin branches stripped of bark and soaked to make them pliable. "It's beautiful," Ruth said, running her fingers along the smooth armrest. "It's crude," Harold countered. The pride crept into his voice despite his critique. "Not what I'd have made in my shop." "No, it's better." Ruth settled onto the seat, testing its strength. "It tells a story." Harold couldn't disagree. Every piece had been selected with care. The naturally curved branch that formed the perfect backrest. The forked piece that created stable front legs. The smaller pieces meticulously woven to form a surprisingly comfortable seat. The chair represented more than just a place to sit. It was Harold's return to his craft, adapted to their circumstances. With no power tools, limited materials, and arthritis that made fine work challenging, he had been forced to reimagine his approach to woodworking. "We should make another," Ruth suggested. "For when we have visitors." The idea of visitors no longer seemed absurd. Tom and Sarah Jenkins had been by twice to help with the roof, bringing additional materials each time. Ray Cooper stopped regularly, often with small offerings, a box of nails, spare hinges, once a hand-cranked drill that had been his father's. The house itself had transformed dramatically. What had once been a dangerous, crumbling shell now showed clear signs of revival. The roof, while not complete, had proper shingles over the main living areas instead of tarps. Windows were repaired or replaced with salvaged glass. The smaller bedroom served as their primary living space, clean and weather-tight, while work continued on the other rooms. "I've been thinking," Harold said, watching a kingfisher dive into the river. "And the pile of driftwood we've collected, some pieces would make good picture frames." Ruth nodded encouragingly. "For the photographs in the van?" Their few family photographs remained packed away, too painful a reminder of the normal life they'd lost and the pretense they maintained with their children. "Maybe it's time to bring them out," Harold suggested. "Make this place feel more like ours." The next morning, they retrieved the small box of personal mementos from the van. Spreading the photographs on their makeshift table, they were struck by the contrast between the smiling faces in formal settings and their current reality. "We should tell them," Ruth said quietly, touching a photo of their son James and his family. "About all of this," Harold tensed. "And admit we've been lying? That we lost everything, that we found a new beginning," Ruth corrected gently. "Look what we've accomplished already." Before Harold could respond, they heard a vehicle approaching. Through the window, they spotted an unfamiliar car, not one of the trucks their neighbors drove, but a newer sedan that seemed out of place on their rutted drive. A woman emerged, mid-30s perhaps, with a notebook and camera. She surveyed the property before approaching the house. "Hello?" she called. "Anyone home?" Harold opened the door cautiously. "Can I help you?" "I hope so. I'm Lisa Jameson from the Riverdale Gazette." She extended her hand. "I'm doing a feature on historical homes in the area, and I heard someone was restoring old Joe Finch's place." "Not sure it qualifies as historical," Harold said, shaking her hand reluctantly. "Actually, it does. County records show it was built in 1892, one of the original fishing cabins on this stretch of river." Lisa gestured to the house. "Would you mind if I asked a few questions? Take some photos?" Ruth appeared beside Harold. "We're still in the early stages of restoration." "That's what makes it interesting," Lisa insisted. "The transformation process." Against their initial reservations, Harold and Ruth found themselves giving Lisa a tour, explaining their incremental approach to repairs and restoration. Harold showed her the driftwood chair, which she photographed from multiple angles, asking detailed questions about his process. "So you were a professional furniture maker?" Lisa asked, scribbling notes. "Woodworker, yes. Had my own shop for 30 years, and now you're applying those skills to restore this historic property. Fascinating." Lisa's enthusiasm seemed genuine. "What made you decide to take on such a challenging project at, forgive me, your stage of life?" Harold and Ruth exchanged glances, silently debating how much to reveal. "We were ready for a change," Ruth answered carefully. "A chance to build something meaningful in our retirement years. Not the whole truth, but not entirely false. Mind if I come back as the work progresses?" "Document the transformation?" Lisa asked. "Human interest stories about preservation and craftsmanship are popular with our readers." After she left, promising to send them a copy of the article when published, Harold and Ruth sat in silence on the porch, the driftwood chair between them. "She has no idea we live here because we have nowhere else," Harold finally said. "Does it matter?" Ruth countered. "We're doing exactly what she thinks, restoring this place, creating something meaningful." Harold nodded slowly, his gaze drawn to the chair he'd crafted. From discarded materials washed up by the river, he had created something functional, even beautiful in its rustic way. Perhaps their lives followed a similar pattern. Broken pieces reassembled into something unexpected, but somehow right. "I'll start on that second chair tomorrow," he decided. "And maybe those picture frames." Ruth smiled, understanding the significance of this shift. "No, just building emergency shelter anymore, but creating a home worth sharing, with neighbors, with a curious journalist, and perhaps soon, with their children." The Riverdale Farmers Market occupied the town square every Saturday, rain or shine. Harold and Ruth had avoided it during their van-dwelling days, unable to justify spending precious dollars on fresh produce when canned goods were more economical. But Martha Cooper had insisted they join her this morning, promising to introduce them to more neighbors. "Everyone's been asking about you too," Martha explained, as they walked between stalls of autumn produce, handcrafts, and baked goods. That article in the Gazette really got people interested. Lisa's feature had appeared 3 weeks ago, a half-page spread with photos of their restoration work and Harold's driftwood furniture. The headline, "Historic River Cabin Finds New Life in Skilled Hands," had transformed them from anonymous newcomers to minor local celebrities. "Harold!" Ray waved from a booth displaying honey jars. "Come meet my brother-in-law, best beekeeper in 3 counties." As they navigated the market, Ruth noticed the disorganized collection of paper notices tacked to the park's central oak tree. Help wanted, items for sale, community events, all fluttering in the breeze and deteriorating in the elements. "Seems inefficient," she remarked to Sam Wilson, who managed the market. "All those notices getting damaged or blown away," Sam sighed. "Been meaning to build a proper bulletin board for years. Never enough time or money in the budget. Harold could build one," Ruth said, the words emerging before she could consult her husband. Harold raised his eyebrows but didn't contradict her. "Really?" Sam looked intrigued. "Market committee has about $60 we could put toward materials." "I'd need to design something weatherproof," Harold said, professional interest already engaged. "Maybe with a hinged cover to protect the notices. If you could make it portable so we can move it indoors during winter market." "That would be ideal," Sam added. By the time they left the market, Harold had a commission and a new purpose in his step. That evening, he sketched designs at their kitchen table, now a proper table Harold had constructed from salvaged boards. "You volunteered me pretty quickly," he noted without rancor. Ruth smiled. "I've watched you looking for something more satisfying than endless house repairs. This is a chance to create something new, not just fix what's broken." The bulletin board project consumed Harold for the next week. Working with limited tools and materials required ingenious solutions. He repurposed siding from their shed demolition for the frame, salvaged hinges from an old cabinet for the protective doors, and sealed everything with natural oils to resist weather damage. "It looks professional," Ruth observed as Harold applied final touches. "Not quite what I'd have made in my shop," Harold replied, though with less regret than similar statements in the past. "But it'll serve its purpose." Delivering the finished piece to the market the following Saturday became an unexpected event. Sam insisted on a small ceremony, gathering vendors and shoppers to admire Harold's craftsmanship. "First official posting goes to the creators," Sam announced, handing Ruth a pin and blank notice card. Ruth hesitated, then wrote, "Furniture repair and custom woodworking. Harold Mitchell." She added their location and carefully pinned it inside the new board. "You're advertising my services?" Harold asked quietly. "You've still got your skills," Ruth replied. "And we could use the income." Throughout the day, people approached them differently than before. Not with the cautious sympathy of neighbors helping struggling newcomers, but with the respect accorded to skilled artisans. 3 people inquired about furniture repair, and 1 woman commissioned a small table similar to the one Harold had made for their kitchen. "You've built more than a bulletin board," Ruth observed as they walked home. "You've built a bridge back to your profession." Harold nodded thoughtfully. "A modified version, anyway. No power tools, limited materials. Constraints that make your work unique," Ruth countered. "That bulletin board has character mass-produced ones never would." Back home, they found a young couple examining their property from the road. The woman waved when she noticed them approaching. "Sorry to intrude," she called. "We saw the article about your restoration. We just bought the Lawson cottage down the river. It needs similar work. We were hoping for advice," her partner added. "Maybe recommendations on where to start." Harold and Ruth exchanged glances. 3 months ago, they had been the ones desperately in need of guidance. "The roof first," Harold said. "Always the roof. Would you like to come in for tea?" Ruth offered. "We can show you what we've accomplished so far." As they led the young couple through their home, still rough but increasingly comfortable, Ruth felt a shift in her perception. They were no longer recipients of charity, but contributors with valuable experience to share. Later, after their visitors left with pages of notes and promises to return, Harold sat in his driftwood chair watching the river. "I never expected to be teaching others," he said. Not at this stage of life under these circumstances. Ruth touched his shoulder gently. The bulletin board opened more doors than we anticipated. Harold covered her hand with his. Think any of my old clients would recognize me now? Grey hair, wrinkled hands, making furniture from driftwood and fallen trees? They'd recognize your craftsmanship, Ruth said firmly. Just as our new neighbors do, the bulletin board had transformed more than their standing in the community. It had reawakened Harold's identity as a creator rather than merely a survivor. Ruth watched his eyes trace the river's flow, no longer seeing just driftwood, but potential furniture, picture frames, perhaps even art. "What will you build next?" she asked. Harold smiled, the expression reaching his eyes more easily than it had months ago. "Whatever's needed. Try this one," Ruth said, handing Harold a small, misshapen tomato. They sat on their completed porch, now sturdy and welcoming, with two matching driftwood chairs and a small table between them. Harold bit into the fruit, juice running down his chin. "Sweet," he pronounced. "Better than store-bought." Ruth beamed with pride, surveying her garden, once an overgrown tangle, now neat rows of vegetables bordered by flowers sprouting from old Joe's seed packets. Not all had germinated, but enough had survived to add splashes of color among the practical crops. "Should have enough for a proper harvest next week," she said. "The basket's almost ready too." Inside, soaking in a wash tub, thin strips of willow branches awaited Ruth's attention. Another skill rediscovered, basket weaving, learned in a community class decades ago, now put to practical use. 6 months had passed since they'd purchased the house. Winter had tested them severely. Cold nights huddled around the wood stove, strategic placement of heated bricks wrapped in towels to warm their bed, melting snow for water when the rain barrels froze. But they had endured, and spring had brought renewal to both the land and their spirits. Harold's furniture repair business had grown steadily. Word of his craftsmanship spread beyond their immediate community, bringing clients who appreciated the distinctive character of his work. Ruth had started teaching again in a small way, gardening workshops at the community center, sharing knowledge gleaned from decades of hobby gardening and more recent lessons in subsistence growing. "James called while you were at the Cooper place," Harold mentioned, referring to their son. "Said he might visit next month." Ruth's hands stilled on the tomato she was examining. "Did you tell him?" "Some, not everything." Harold wiped tomato juice from his beard. "Said we'd bought a fixer-upper by the river, that we're renovating it ourselves." "How did he take it?" "Surprised. Concerned about whether the work is too much for us." Harold's smile held irony. "Offered to help financially." Ruth shook her head, remembering their determination not to burden their children. "And you said?" "That we're managing fine. That we'd love to see him." Harold paused. "It's true, Ruth, we are managing. More than managing," Ruth thought, looking at their transformed home. The house now stood weatherproof and solid, its exterior freshly painted in a warm cream color, donated by a grateful client of Harold's. Inside, they had running water pumped from the well they'd restored, a composting toilet system that worked surprisingly well, and solar panels that provided enough electricity for basic lighting and occasional use of small appliances. Their lives bore little resemblance to their previous existence of comfortable retirement, but hardship had forged something unexpectedly satisfying: purpose, connection, the deep satisfaction of creating a life with their own hands. The sound of a car drew their attention to the drive, now properly gravelled thanks to a community work day organized by Ray Cooper. "That's Lisa from the Gazette," Ruth observed. "Wonder what brings her back." The journalist approached with the confident stride of someone who felt welcome. "Hope I'm not interrupting. I brought copies of today's paper." She handed them the latest edition, folded to display a full-page spread. 6 months later, River Cabin Renaissance inspires community. Harold adjusted his reading glasses, scanning the article that chronicled their progress and, more surprisingly, its impact on the broader community. Lisa had interviewed neighbors, clients, and participants in Ruth's gardening workshops, all describing how the Mitchells' example had inspired their own projects and community involvement. We've become a human interest story, Harold remarked dryly. People connect with what you're doing, Lisa replied. Two seniors taking on a massive restoration with minimal resources, succeeding through skill and community connection. It's inspiring. Ruth studied the photographs accompanying the article, their house transformation shown in before and after images, Harold demonstrating woodworking techniques to neighborhood children, Ruth's flourishing garden. There's something else, Lisa said. The regional magazine wants to feature you in their second act series. More in-depth professional photography. I'm not sure we're comfortable with that much attention, Harold began. They pay, Lisa added. Not a fortune, but enough to make it worth considering. After she left, promising to email details, Harold and Ruth returned to their evening ritual of porch sitting, watching the river flow while discussing the day's events. We've become local celebrities, Ruth mused, returning to her basket weaving. The willow strips bent easily under her practiced fingers. Hardly celebrities, Harold countered. Just old people who refused to give up. Ruth's basket took shape, sturdy, practical, yet possessing a simple beauty. Like their lives, she thought. Functional by necessity, but with room for grace notes. Flowers among vegetables. Carved details on utilitarian furniture. James will see a very different life than what we pretended to have on those phone calls, she said. Harold nodded. Good. No more pretending. The following morning, Ruth rose early to harvest vegetables for their weekly contribution to the community food pantry. The basket she'd completed the night before waited for its inaugural use. As she carefully arranged tomatoes, beans, and early squash in the basket, Ruth reflected on the fullness of their lives, not measured in possessions or comfort anymore, but in the tangible results of their labor, the depth of new friendships, the satisfaction of skills shared and received. When Harold joined her, coffee mugs in hand, she presented the filled basket with quiet pride. Our first real harvest, she said. Enough to share. Harold studied the abundant display, then met Ruth's eyes. Remember when we thought we'd lost everything? Ruth nodded, understanding the unspoken completion of his thought. In losing what they had, they'd discovered what they could create. The basket of vegetables represented more than food. It symbolized their transformation from desperate survivors to contributors, from homeless to home creators. We found something better, she replied simply, and together they carried the basket of plenty to the waiting world. Ruth noticed the orange flags first. They dotted the riverbank like unnatural flowers, appearing overnight while she and Harold slept. From their porch, she counted 7 markers forming a line that cut through neighboring properties. Harold, she called, interrupting his morning coffee. Someone's been on our land. They investigated together, finding the small plastic flags attached to metal wire stakes, each bearing the inscription, SRD Property Survey, Do Not Remove. SRD. Ruth wondered aloud. What's that? Harold shook his head, concern etching deeper lines around his eyes. No idea, but I don't like strangers marking our property without permission. They didn't have to wonder long. By afternoon, Ray Cooper arrived in his pickup, expression grim beneath his weathered hat. You've seen the markers? He asked without preamble. Harold nodded. What's going on, Ray? Silver River Developments, Ray replied, the name sounding like a curse on his tongue. Big outfit from the city. Been buying waterfront properties downriver for months. Word is, they're planning some kind of luxury resort community. Ruth's hand found Harold's, squeezing tight. But our property isn't for sale. Don't matter to these folks, Ray said. They get what they want. Been approaching everyone along this stretch. Offering good money too, I'll admit. They haven't approached us, Harold pointed out. They will, Ray assured him. Those survey markers are usually their first move. Checking what they're buying before making offers, after Ray left, promising to share any information he gathered. Ruth and Harold sat in their driftwood chairs, the river flowing peacefully before them, unaware its future was being decided by distant corporate interests. We just got settled, Ruth said quietly. Made this place ours. Harold's face had settled into the stoic mask Ruth recognized from their darkest days of homelessness. "We're not selling. They might offer enough for us to buy something else. Something that doesn't need—" "This isn't about money," Harold interrupted, surprising her with his vehemence. "This is our home. We built it back with our own hands," Ruth nodded, relieved by his certainty. "I agree. I just wanted to make sure we were united." The representative from Silver River Developments arrived 3 days later, a woman in her 30s named Diane Mercer, whose crisp business attire looked out of place on their rustic property. "Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell," she began after introductions, "I represent a development company with an exciting vision for this riverfront area. We're interested in purchasing your property as part of a larger project." They sat at the kitchen table Harold had crafted. The contrast between their handmade home and the glossy brochures Diane spread before them impossible to ignore. "The Riverside Retreat will feature luxury vacation homes, a boutique hotel and marina facilities," Diane explained, displaying architectural renderings of modern structures that bore no resemblance to the existing character of the river community. "And the current houses?" Ruth asked. "What happens to them?" Diane's smile never wavered. "Most will be removed to make way for new construction. However, we are considering preserving 1 or 2 historic structures as part of the resort's aesthetic appeal." "Our home isn't for sale," Harold stated flatly. Diane's smile tightened slightly. "I understand your attachment, Mr. Mitchell. That's why I'm authorized to offer substantially above market value." She wrote a figure on a notepad and slid it across the table. The number made. Ruth inhaled sharply, enough to buy a comfortable home elsewhere, with money left over for security in their remaining years. "We've put thousands of hours into restoring this house," Harold responded. "Its value to us can't be measured in dollars." "I respect that position," Diane said smoothly, retrieving her notepad. "But I encourage you to discuss it privately. Development is coming to this area, whether individual owners participate or not. Those who sell early typically receive the best offers." After she left, Ruth and Harold walked their property in silence, stopping at each orange surveyor's flag, the plastic markers suddenly ominous in their cheerful brightness. "That's a lot of money," Ruth finally said. "Is it enough to buy what we've created here?" Harold asked. "The community, the purpose, the life we've built?" Ruth shook her head. "No, but I needed to hear you say it." The following morning brought a knock at their door. Tom and Sarah Jenkins stood on the porch, faces drawn with worry. "You got a visit too?" Tom asked. Harold nodded, inviting them inside. "They offered us a fortune," Sarah admitted, accepting tea from Ruth. "More than we ever dreamed this place would be worth. But you're considering refusing." Ruth guessed. Tom nodded. "This land's been in Sarah's family 4 generations. Her grandfather built our house with timber cut from the property. Some things shouldn't have a price tag. We're not selling either," Harold told them. "But Diane implied the development would happen with or without our participation. That's why we're here," Sarah explained. "Ray Cooper's called a community meeting tonight at the Market Pavilion. Everyone affected by this development needs to come." That evening, Harold and Ruth were shocked by the turnout. Not just their immediate neighbors, but dozens of community members packed the pavilion, faces concerned beneath the string lights. Ray stood on a makeshift platform, addressing the crowd. "Silver River Developments has purchased 3 properties downriver already. They're targeting 12 more, including most of our riverfront community." Murmurs rippled through the gathering. Harold recognized the mixture of emotions, fear, anger, resolve, reflected in the faces around him. The same emotions that had carried him and Ruth through their darkest days. "We need to decide as a community how to respond," Ray continued. "Some folks want to sell, others refuse. But whatever we do, we should do it together and with full information." As the meeting progressed, Harold felt Ruth's hand slip into his. Around them, a community they joined only months ago now faced a threat to its very existence. The orange flags marking their property suddenly seemed like just the first harbingers of a much larger storm approaching their riverside haven. The community meeting had stretched late into the night, revealing deep divisions among the Riverside residents. Some, particularly older homeowners on fixed incomes, viewed Silver River's offer as a godsend. Others, like the Mitchells, refused to consider selling at any price. Most fell somewhere between, reluctant to leave, but tempted by financial security the development promised. "We need leverage," Ray had concluded. "Something to slow them down while we organize." 2 weeks later, Harold spotted an unfamiliar figure by their riverbank, a woman with binoculars and professional camera equipment. His first thought was another developer representative conducting assessments. "Excuse me," he called, approaching with caution. "This is private property." The woman turned, apologetic. "I'm sorry. I should have asked permission." She extended her hand. "Dr. Eleanor Wong, ornithologist with State University. I'm documenting blue heron nesting sites along this river system." Harold's wariness transformed to interest. "Herons here?" Dr. Wong nodded enthusiastically. "A mating pair has established territory in that stand of cottonwoods." She pointed to trees partially visible from their property. "It's unusual to find them nesting this close to human habitation. May I ask how long you've lived here?" "About 8 months," Harold replied. "But the house was abandoned for years before we bought it." "That explains it," Dr. Wong said, making notes. "They established the nesting site during the period of low human activity. Now they've acclimated to your presence." After explaining her research project, Dr. Wong asked permission to access the riverbank periodically for observation. Harold readily agreed, walking her back to the house to meet Ruth. Over tea at their kitchen table, the conversation shifted to the development threat. Dr. Wong's expression grew serious as Harold described Silver River's plans. "A marina would be devastating for the herons," she said. "Construction noise alone would likely drive them away, not to mention the ongoing boat traffic." "Is there any protection for them?" Ruth asked. "Legally, I mean? Potentially." Dr. Wong tapped her pen thoughtfully against her notepad. "Great blue herons aren't endangered, but this particular river system has seen significant habitat loss. The State Environmental Protection Office has been monitoring declining breeding populations. A documented nesting site could trigger review requirements for any development." Hope flickered in Harold and Ruth's exchange of glances. "What kind of documentation would be needed?" Harold asked. "Photographs, observation logs, habitat mapping?" Dr. Wong hesitated. "I can provide my research data, but it would carry more weight coming from affected property owners as well." After she left, promising to return with proper paperwork for their participation in her study, Harold and Ruth immediately called Ray. "Environmental protection angle," Ray mused over the phone. "Worth pursuing. The Jenkinses mentioned seeing river otters too. I'll spread the word. Everyone should document wildlife on their properties." The following week, Dr. Wong returned with not only research forms, but a framed photograph, a stunning image of the blue heron pair at their nest, the distinctive bend of the river behind them, clearly placing the location on the Mitchells' property. "For you," she said, presenting the frame. "And copies for the environmental impact report we're preparing." "We?" Ruth asked. Dr. Wong smiled. "My department has taken an interest in this situation. Development versus habitat preservation is precisely the type of community-based environmental issue we study. Several of my colleagues have offered to help document the ecosystem along this stretch of river." The photograph took place of honor on their living room wall, not just for its beauty, but for the hope it represented. Within days, university researchers became a common sight along the riverbank, cataloging plant and animal species, taking water samples, mapping critical habitat zones. Silver River Development's response came swiftly. Diane Mercer reappeared at their door, her professional demeanor noticeably strained. "Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell," she began after declining their offer of tea, "I understand you're working with university researchers on some kind of environmental study. We've given permission for wildlife documentation on our property," Harold confirmed. "As is our right." Diane's smile tightened. "Of course. However, I should inform you that Silver River has already completed comprehensive environmental assessments. Our project will fully comply with all regulations. That's reassuring, Ruth replied pleasantly. Then the additional research being conducted shouldn't pose any problems. Diane's composure slipped momentarily. Silver River is prepared to increase our offer by 15% to expedite this process. Construction timelines are already established. Our home isn't for sale at any price, Harold stated, the repetition becoming a mantra. But thank you for the information about your timelines. We'll pass that along to the research team. After Diane left, her departure noticeably less composed than her arrival. Harold and Ruth stood before the heron photograph, studying the magnificent birds who had unwittingly become their allies. They seem so peaceful, Ruth observed. No idea they're now at the center of a property battle. Like us 8 months ago, Harold replied. Just looking for a quiet place to exist. The university involvement had energized the community. That evening, their phone rang continuously with updates from neighbors. The Jenkins family had documented otter tracks and a den. The Coopers had identified a rare native plant species in their wetland area. Someone else had photographed endangered dragonflies. We're building a case, Ray reported during his visit later that week. State Environmental Protection Office has agreed to review our documentation before approving any development permits. Will it be enough? Ruth asked. Ray's weathered face showed cautious optimism. Maybe. At minimum, it buys us time. And sometimes that's all you need for circumstances to change. Harold nodded, understanding this truth intimately. 8 months ago, they had needed just enough time in their van to spot an abandoned house across the river, a moment that had altered everything. Perhaps the blue herons, captured so perfectly in the photograph on their wall, would provide that critical moment for their entire community. James will be here tomorrow, Ruth said, folding laundry they'd hung to dry in the fresh spring air. A year had passed since they purchased their riverside home, the seasons completing a full cycle of challenges and triumphs. Harold nodded, distracted by the papers spread across their kitchen table, property maps, environmental reports, and the latest communication from the State Environmental Protection Office. Did you hear me? Ruth asked. Our son is visiting tomorrow. Sorry. Harold removed his reading glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. I'm listening now, James, tomorrow. Ruth set aside the laundry and joined him at the table. You're worried about the meeting tonight. The preliminary review only grants us temporary protection, Harold explained, tapping the official letter. Silver River has hired environmental consultants to counter the university's findings. But we have the community behind us now, Ruth reminded him. That counts for something. The division that had characterized their first community meeting had largely dissolved in the months since, as Silver River's tactics grew more aggressive, including veiled threats of eminent domain and unannounced property inspections. Neighbors had united in resistance. The petitions reached over 800 signatures, Ruth continued, lifting the thick stack of papers bearing the heading, Preserve Our Riverside Community. The document had circulated far beyond their immediate neighborhood, gathering support from throughout the region. Petitions don't stop bulldozers, Harold said, then immediately regretted his tone. I'm sorry. You're right. Community support matters. Ruth covered his hand with hers. One battle at a time, remember? Tonight is the town council meeting. Tomorrow we welcome our son and show him the life we've built here. That evening the town hall overflowed with people. Harold and Ruth arrived early but still had to stand at the back, amazed by the turnout. Many faces were unfamiliar. Residents from other parts of town who had no direct stake in the riverfront but had rallied to their cause nonetheless. Mayor Wilson called the meeting to order, explaining the purpose: to hear community input before the town council voted on whether to support the Riverside residents' petition for environmental review or back Silver River's development proposal. Representatives from Silver River presented first, showcasing glossy renderings of the proposed resort and emphasizing economic benefits. jobs created, tax revenue increased, tourism boosted. This development will put Riverdale on the map, Diane Mercer concluded, her professional poise fully restored. We're offering progress and prosperity. Dr. Wong followed with the university's findings, detailed maps of habitat zones, documented wildlife populations, and water quality assessments. This river system represents one of the few remaining intact riparian ecosystems in the region, she explained, her academic tone lending weight to the presentation. Development at the scale proposed would cause irreversible damage. Public comment came next. Ray Cooper spoke eloquently about generational connection to the land. The Jenkins family presented evidence of historical significance, their property's inclusion in the registry of century farms. One by one, residents shared personal stories of what the river community meant to them. When Harold's turn came, he approached the microphone with uncharacteristic nervousness. Public speaking had never been his strength. My wife and I bought our home a year ago when we had nothing left, he began, his voice steadier than he felt. It was just a broken-down fisherman's cabin then. Many of you have seen what it's become through hard work and community support. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Silver River sees our properties as real estate transactions, numbers on a balance sheet. But we're not selling square footage or river frontage. We're protecting homes, legacy, a way of life that can't be replaced with dollar figures. Harold gestured to the packed room. Look around. This is what community looks like. People who help their neighbors roof houses, who bring food when someone is sick, who teach each other skills and share resources. He lifted the petition. 873 signatures. People who believe this riverside community deserves to exist, that some things shouldn't have a price tag. I ask the council to stand with your constituents, not outside developers. The room erupted in applause as Harold returned to Ruth's side, her eyes shining with pride. After 3 hours of testimony, Mayor Wilson called for the council vote. The tension in the room was palpable as each member cast their ballot. The final tally, 4-3 in favor of supporting the environmental review petition and implementing a 6-month moratorium on development along the river. The celebration spilled out of Town Hall and into the local diner, where Harold and Ruth found themselves surrounded by neighbors and newfound allies. It's just a temporary victory, Ray cautioned over coffee. Silver River won't give up easily, but it gives us time, Tom Jenkins pointed out. Time to file for historical designation, strengthen the environmental case, explore legal options. Ruth squeezed Harold's hand beneath the table. Time is all we've ever needed. Later that night, back in the home they'd rebuilt with their own hands, they made final preparations for James's visit. Harold hung a new curtain in the guest room, formerly the second bedroom, now fully restored. Ruth arranged wildflowers in a vase she'd found at the community thrift store. Do you think he'll understand? Harold asked quietly. Why we chose this life instead of asking for his help? Ruth smoothed the quilt on the guest bed, another community gift, hand-stitched by Martha Cooper during winter evenings. He'll see that we aren't just surviving here, we're thriving. Outside, the river flowed steadily past their home, indifferent to human concerns yet central to the battle being waged. The petition sat on their kitchen table, hundreds of signatures representing a community united by more than geography, bound together by shared values and mutual support. Tomorrow would bring their son, with questions they were finally ready to answer. Beyond that loomed the continued fight for their home. But tonight they had won a victory worth celebrating, proving that even the smallest voices could be powerful when joined in chorus. You built all this? James Mitchell stood on the porch, his expression caught between disbelief and admiration as he surveyed the garden, the workshop, the carefully restored exterior of his parents' home. At 45, he had his father's height and his mother's thoughtful eyes, currently wide with astonishment. Rebuilt, Harold corrected, watching his son's reaction carefully. With a lot of help from neighbors. Ruth embraced James again, still emotional after their reunion. Come inside. There's so much to tell you. The afternoon unfolded in waves of revelation. Over lunch prepared from Ruth's garden, they shared the unvarnished truth, the medical bills, the eviction, months living in the van, the discovery of the abandoned house, their journey from homelessness to home creation. "Why didn't you tell me?" James asked, hurt evident in his voice. "I could have helped." "Pride," Harold admitted, "and not wanting to burden you. You have your own family, your own responsibilities." "But you're my parents," James insisted. "What if something had happened during those months in the van?" Ruth touched his hand. "We made a mistake in not being honest. But look at what came from our struggle. This home, this community, a new purpose we might never have found otherwise." After lunch, they walked the property, showing James the improvements they'd made and the challenges still ahead. His expression softened as he witnessed his father's craftsmanship in every corner of the house, his mother's flourishing garden, the evident care that had transformed a ruin into a home. "And now there's the development threat," Harold explained, in pointing to where survey markers had once stood before being removed by order of the Environmental Review. "That's where the Heritage Assessment Team is coming tomorrow," Ruth added, leading them toward a massive oak tree near the river's edge, a giant they estimated to be over 2 centuries old. The university's architectural historian believes this oak may have been used as a landmark by early settlers, Harold explained. "It appears on river maps dating back to 1837. James studied the ancient tree, its sprawling branches creating a canopy that shaded half their garden. And that helps your case against the developers. Every bit of historical and environmental significance strengthens our position," Ruth confirmed. "The blue herons, the river otters, now possibly this heritage oak." As they continued their tour, a truck pulled into the drive, Tom Jenkins and his teenage son, with fishing poles. "Hope we're not interrupting," Tom called. "Just thought your visitor might enjoy catching dinner. The bass are biting today." James looked to his father with surprise. "You fish now?" "Not as much as Tom," Harold replied with a smile. "But yes, we've learned to appreciate the river's bounty." While James joined the Jenkins men at the river, Ruth and Harold prepared the kitchen for their potential catch. "He's processing a lot," Ruth observed, "slicing vegetables. Finding out his parents were homeless, that we've been living this completely different life," Harold nodded. "I see his engineer's mind trying to solve problems we've already addressed, calculating what he could have done differently." "Just like his father," Ruth said with a knowing smile. When James returned triumphant with 2 respectable bass, dinner became a community affair. The Jenkins family stayed. Martha Cooper arrived with freshly baked bread, and Ray appeared with his famous blackberry cobbler over dinner. Conversation flowed from fishing techniques to the ongoing development battle to James's own family back in Seattle. Ruth watched her son gradually relax into the warmth of their community, his initial shock giving way to curiosity and tentative appreciation. After their guests departed, James helped clean up, then joined his parents on the porch for a nightcap of Ray's homemade elderberry wine. "I've been thinking," he began carefully. "My company has an environmental law division. I could talk to some colleagues about your situation with Silver River." "We wouldn't want to impose," Harold started, but James shook his head. "This isn't charity, Dad. It's family helping family. The way it should have been from the beginning." His voice held no accusation, only resolve. "I have resources that could help protect what you've built here." Harold and Ruth exchanged glances, their silent communication honed by decades together. "We'd appreciate that," Harold said finally, the words clearly difficult for him. "But this fight isn't just for our home. It's for the entire Riverside community." "I understand," James replied, studying the ancient oak silhouetted against the night sky. "That tree has stood here through generations of change. It deserves to see many more." The following morning, the Heritage Assessment Team arrived, 2 architectural historians and a dendrochronologist specializing in dating trees through growth ring analysis. Harold, Ruth and James watched as they examined the oak, taking core samples and photographs. measuring its circumference and documenting its location relative to historical river maps. "This is extraordinary," the lead historian announced after their assessment. "Preliminary dating suggests this oak predates European settlement in this region. It's likely over 250 years old and would qualify for heritage tree protection under state law." "What does that mean for the development plans?" James asked. "Heritage tree designation creates a protected zone of 150 feet in all directions," the historian explained. "No construction or landscape alteration would be permitted within that boundary." The implications were immediately clear. Such a protection zone would render Silver River's current development plan impossible, as the heritage oak stood strategically near the center of the proposed marina location. As the assessment team packed their equipment, promising a formal report within weeks, James turned to his parents with newfound respect in his eyes. "You didn't just build a home," he said quietly. "You became guardians of something much older and more significant than any of us." Ruth smiled, linking her arm through Harold's. "We just wanted a place to belong. The river and this land did the rest." That evening, beneath the spreading branches of the oak that had suddenly become central to their future, 3 generations of Mitchells gathered, Harold and Ruth, James, and on a video call, James's wife and children, seeing their grandparents' home for the first time. "It's beautiful," their granddaughter declared, eyes wide as the camera panned across the riverside sunset. "Will it still be there when we visit this summer?" "Yes," Harold answered with newfound confidence. "We believe it will be here for many summers to come." The Council of Environmental Quality has determined that the proposed Silver River development project poses significant risk to protected habitats and historical resources. Harold read aloud from the official letter, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "Therefore, all development permits are denied pending comprehensive revision of the proposed plan." Ruth clasped his hand across their kitchen table, where they sat with Ray Cooper and Tom Jenkins. 14 months of uncertainty, of community organizing, of legal battles and environmental assessments, distilled into a single, decisive paragraph. "They're not giving up entirely," Tom cautioned, pointing to later paragraphs. "It says here they can submit a revised plan that preserves the heritage zones and wildlife corridors. But it would be a fraction of what they originally intended," Ray noted. "No marina, no luxury condos along this stretch. The economics won't pencil out," Harold nodded. James called this morning. His contacts at Silver River confirmed they're considering pulling out completely, looking at lakefront property in the next county instead. The possibility hung in the air between them, not just a temporary reprieve, but potentially a permanent victory. After their guests departed, promising to spread the news throughout the community, Ruth found Harold in his workshop, meticulously carving a piece of cherry wood. "What are you making?" she asked, though the emerging shape gave her some idea. "A river map," Harold replied, his hands steady as he followed the contours he had sketched. "Topographical, showing our whole community, the bends in the river, the heritage oak, the heron nesting grounds." Ruth watched as familiar landmarks took shape beneath his skilled hands, their riverside neighborhood rendered in beautiful relief, with tiny carved houses marking each neighbor's property. Their shared home was there too, a small but distinct shape in the larger tapestry. "For the community center," Harold explained, "a reminder of what we fought for, what we protected. It's beautiful," Ruth said, meaning more than the carving itself. 2 weeks later, the community gathered for their annual Riverside Festival, the atmosphere jubilant with their recent victory. Harold's river map held a place of honor in the community center, where residents and visitors alike traced the familiar contours, identifying their homes and favorite fishing spots. "The Mitchells, our local heroes," Mayor Wilson announced during the celebration. "Who would have thought that 2 newcomers would end up leading the charge to save our riverside?" Harold shook his head modestly. "We just had the most to lose. Everyone here fought alongside us." It was true. The battle had transformed their community, strengthening bonds that would have taken decades to form under normal circumstances. The initial division between those willing to sell and those determined to stay had dissolved in the face of Silver River's increasingly aggressive tactics, unifying the Riverside residents in common purpose. Their home had continued to evolve as well. With the development threat receding, Harold and Ruth had turned their attention to long-term improvements: solar panel expansion, a rainwater collection system, an outdoor kitchen for summer gatherings. Their garden had tripled in size, producing enough for themselves and a substantial contribution to the community food pantry. "Mom, Dad," a familiar voice called. They turned to find James approaching with his wife Laura and their 2 children. "You're early," Ruth exclaimed, embracing each family member in turn. "We weren't expecting you until tomorrow." "The kids couldn't wait," Laura explained, smiling as their grandchildren immediately began exploring the festival. "And I wanted to deliver this in person," James added, producing an envelope from his jacket pocket. "The official heritage tree designation for your oak, state-protected status, registered in the National Registry of Historic Trees. Silver River would need an act of Congress to touch it now." Harold accepted the document with reverence. "This means everything, not everything," James corrected gently. "Just one more layer of protection for the home you've created." He gestured to the community around them, neighbors who had become friends, strangers who had become allies. A riverside gathering that felt more like family reunion than civic event. As evening approached, the celebration moved to the riverbank. Tables laden with potluck dishes stretched beneath string lights, while children played tag between the ancient oak trees that had stood sentinel over generations of riverside life. Harold found Ruth at the water's edge, watching their grandchildren skip stones across the river's surface. James patiently demonstrating the proper technique. "They want to stay for the whole summer," Ruth said, as Harold joined her. Laura suggested they could help in the garden. "Learn how we've been living," Harold nodded, watching his son, the corporate engineer from Seattle, laughing as he waded ankle-deep into the river to retrieve a particularly promising skipping stone. "They seem different here, more relaxed. This place changes people," Ruth observed. "It changed us." Harold's gaze traveled to their home, visible through the trees, no longer a desperate last resort, but a deliberate choice, a statement of values. From the porch hung a banner created by the community's children. "Thank you, River Guardians. Remember when we thought we'd lost everything?" Ruth asked, echoing a question they'd posed to each other at various milestones of their journey. Harold nodded, his arm encircling her shoulders as they watched fireflies begin their evening dance over the water. "We found something better." Behind them, the carved river map in the community center told their story in silent contours of wood. A river's path, a community's stand, and 2 people who had discovered that sometimes losing everything is merely the beginning of finding what truly matters. The young woman adjusting the camera lens looked nothing like the journalist who had first discovered their story 2 years earlier. Where Lisa Jameson had been professionally polished, Emily Chen radiated casual enthusiasm beneath her baseball cap, her production company's logo, Real Life Films, embroidered on her shirt. "Just pretend I'm not here," Emily instructed, though the camera made that impossible. "Continue working in your garden as you normally would." Ruth smiled, returning to her harvest of summer tomatoes, while Harold tended to the irrigation system he'd designed from repurposed materials. 2 years after purchasing their riverside home, life had settled into satisfying rhythms of purpose and community. Silver River Developments had officially abandoned their plans 6 months earlier, selling their acquired properties to a land conservation trust. The riverside community had not only survived but thrived, with new families moving in, attracted by the tight-knit neighborhood and environmental values. Emily had arrived 3 days ago, intrigued by a social media post about the River Guardians and their successful stand against corporate development. What had begun as a potential short documentary for her, independent film company had quickly expanded as she discovered the layers of their story. So you lived in the van for how long before finding this place? And she called from behind her camera. Almost 4 months, Harold answered, his comfort with their history grown over time. What had once been a source of shame now felt like an important chapter in their journey, one worth sharing. And you had no idea if you could actually restore the house. Emily pressed, zooming in on Harold's hands as he adjusted the water flow to Ruth's pepper plants. We knew it would be difficult, Ruth replied, selecting a perfectly ripe tomato. But we had nowhere else to go. Sometimes desperation makes the impossible seem worth attempting. Later, Emily filmed them preparing dinner with neighbors in their outdoor kitchen, a community gathering that had become tradition each Sunday. Children played beneath the heritage oak, while adults prepared food harvested from various gardens along the riverside. What you've created here is remarkable, Emily observed during a break in filming. Not just the physical restoration, but the community bonds. Ruth nodded, watching Harold demonstrate woodworking techniques to Ray Cooper's grandchildren. The house gave us purpose, but the people gave us belonging. On Emily's final day, she interviewed them on their porch, now expanded into a wraparound deck that embraced the river view. The driftwood chairs had been joined by a matching loveseat, all displaying Harold's evolving craftsmanship. Looking back, Emily asked, "What would you tell yourselves from 2 years ago when you were still living in that van?" Harold and Ruth exchanged glances, their silent communication refined by 50 years of partnership. "I'd tell us that what feels like an ending can become a beginning," Ruth answered. "That losing everything material opens space for something more meaningful. I'd say that skills matter more than savings," Harold added. "And that pride is expensive, but ultimately worthless. Do you regret not asking your children for help sooner?" Emily inquired. "We regret the worry we caused them," Ruth acknowledged, "but not the path we took. James and Marianne visit regularly now. They've learned from our experience too, about resilience, about community, about what truly matters in life." After the filming concluded, Emily joined them for a final riverside dinner. As darkness fell, fireflies illuminated the gathering, like nature's own production lighting. "When will the documentary be finished?" Ray asked, passing a platter of grilled fish caught that morning. "Post-production takes about 3 months, Emily explained. I'll submit to film festivals first, then online platforms. But I'll send you all preview copies before anything goes public." "Hard to imagine strangers watching our lives," Harold mused. "Your story deserves to be shared," Emily insisted. "It's about more than just housing insecurity or environmental activism. It's about rediscovering what community can be in an isolated world." The following morning, as they bid Emily farewell, she handed them a small package. "A thank you gift for opening your lives to my camera." Inside was a digital frame loaded with still photographs she'd captured during her stay. Harold and Ruth in their garden, surrounded by neighbors during a communal meal, sitting in their driftwood chairs watching the sunset, standing beneath the heritage oak with their grandchildren. "I thought you might like to see yourselves through an outsider's eyes," Emily explained. "To see what I see when I look at what you've built here."